So this is the second time in 4 years that I have, on Saturday morning, tossed out the sermon text, the sermon subject, the sermon everything, and started over. And I've done that because preaching is a conversation with you. I said that the first day I was here, and that's still how I look at it. And I've been hearing a lot about a particular subject over the last few weeks. Now, it's a subject that some of you don't care about, and a subject that some of you care about a great deal. And the subject has to do with what gender language do we use to talk about God? Do we call God Father? Do we call God Lord? As we did in that refrain, that's certainly the tradition of the church. But how do we handle the language of gender when we talk about God? And so with that in mind, and I'm, after the 10 o'clock service, actually going to hold a little discussion if you want to come back and talk about it. It's come up there in particular because as our choir director has left, a rumor has sort of gotten around that it's because I didn't want him to do choir anthems that had Father in them. It's a little simplistic, but in any case, so I wanted to talk about it. But let's begin with two scripture passages, one from the first chapter of the Bible and one from, well, the second to last chapter. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them, male and female. God created them. And in Revelation 21, then I saw a new heaven, and I saw a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be God's peoples, and God alone will be with them. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more, not mourning or crying in pain, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Hear what the Spirit is saying to our church. Male and female, God created them in the image of God. So apparently we are to think of God as somehow a union of male and female, masculine and feminine. My father likes to call that the stereo image of God. The idea that God is not necessarily gendered, but there is something about the nature of the presence of God in the world that can be understood by the union of masculine and feminine. But we go from there, from that equal, beautiful vision of what God is to look like, and we got to ask ourselves whether or not the Old Testament continues in that vein. First woman, Eve. She's the one who took the piece of fruit, right? Not so good, not a great image of the feminine. And then there was Sarah, Abraham, the first patriarch, his spouse. He sold her to Pharaoh. Sold her to Pharaoh so that he could protect himself. Not just once, but twice. You got to wonder how the scriptures are looking at the feminine. And then there was Lot's wife. Okay, Lot had the good sense to run from Sodom and Gomorrah and keep on going, but not Lot's wife. She's the one that looked back and turned into a pillar of salt. Again, the feminine gets a hard time. Then there's Hagar. Sarah's slave gets tossed in to be with Abraham, not that she wants a kid by him. Then Sarah abuses her and sends her away. Abraham doesn't do much about that. Then there's Tamar, that's Judah's daughter-in-law, when her husband dies, tricks him into fathering a baby by her by pretending to be a temple prostitute beside the side of the road. Still not a very good image. Then there's Rebekah, it's Isaac's wife, Jacob's mother, who is so sneaky and devious that she manages to fool Esau, telling Jacob how to get the blessing away from his older brother. Then there's that whole thing with Rachel and Leah and their slaves, kind of vying for Jacob's attention by sending in various slaves, see how many children you can get, who can be most important that way, so they're chattel. It gets worse, though. In the book of Judges, this one doesn't get tossed around much in the lectionary or in Sunday school, but there's a Levite who had a concubine with him and went into this city where she was apparently turned over to be raped by the people in the city to protect him. And, she was, of course, defiled by then. So he hacked her into 12 pieces and sent her to the 12 tribes of Israel to get them kind of going so that they would war against this city. And there's Delilah. Once again, the feminine doesn't look too good. She tricks Samson into cutting off his hair. Then we have Bathsheba. Most people don't really blame David for the whole Uriah thing, killing him and all. After all, what was Bathsheba doing on the roof? Even Ruth, dear wonderful woman that she is, she has to put out to Boaz in order to be able to glean the fields. I don't know. Then there's Gomer. That's Hosea's wife, right? And she's thought of as a whore. She goes off and becomes almost like a representative of Israel, because very often in the prophets, Israel is referred to as a whore. The feminine is denigrated. Genesis through to Hosea right now. Esther. Well, Esther's better, I guess, except that Esther is able to stand as queen and is able to help her people. Why? Because she's good in bed. One right after the other, right after the other. The king had concubines come in until finally Esther shows up and he falls in love with her. And she's able to help her people. You got to wonder about the Old Testament's view of the feminine. Now, there are reasons for this. Some of them are decent reasons, some not so decent, but one of the reasons for this is that Israel was putting together an understanding of God that was opposed to the understandings of God that surrounded them. There was a magic view about God, a great deal of sympathetic magic at this time as Israel was coming together and becoming a nation. And a sympathetic magic view of God thinks that they can kind of control God. And so there's a great deal of sexuality involved with controlling the feminine gods of the universe, of the land. And Israel wanted to break with that. And I understand that, but we haven't quite arrived at a stereo image of God. In fact, towards the end of the writing of the Old Testament, it seems as though the writers began to understand that. In fact, it was the last edit of the Old Testament of the Hebrew Scriptures that put Genesis 1 right at the beginning of their Scriptures. Last edit. The other thing that came in at around that time, maybe even a little later, was the Song of Songs. This incredibly beautiful poem that celebrates both the masculine and the feminine in their beautiful union. It's one of the 5 scrolls called the Megillah. And one of those scrolls is read at each of the major festivals in the Jewish religion. What's the most important festival in the Jewish religion? It's Passover, right? Song of Songs is what's read at Passover. So key is it to the understanding of Torah. You know how often we read it in the Christian lectionary? Once in 3 years, 8 verses in chapter 2 that celebrate masculine sexuality. You got to wonder. And yet there it is. The stereo image of God and this hope buried deep in the canon that the masculine and the feminine can find a generative way to come together and to reflect the beauty of who God is and what God does. It's a remarkable vision that seems to be lost. But how about the New Testament? Well, we have Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary, the virgin. Yet this is realistic. This is the picture of feminine sexuality that is not able to have sex. And then, of course, we have the woman at the well, woman of disrepute, and then there's the woman who poured off the perfume onto Jesus' feet. We figure she had to be a hooker because they had to have perfumes around. And then there was the woman caught in adultery. We do at least have Mary and Martha who are struggling to understand the feminine roles. But it's a struggle each step of the way until finally we get to Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, that close person to Jesus. We hear about her in the resurrection appearances, okay, that Mary Magdalene was there. Right? The only other time we hear about her in the Gospels, it says this, Luke 8. Soon afterwards, Jesus went on through the cities and villages and proclaimed and brought good news of the reign of God. And there were 12 with him, as well as some women, by the way, who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. How come church tradition thinks she's a hooker? What is it about our religion, our attitude, our approach to this text that we would conclude that from these verses? You got to wonder about the stereo image of God and whether it's managed to take hold. And behind all of this, you see, is a decidedly masculine deity. I know the reasons, but there it is. We live in a world where rape is a tool of war. We live in a world where women are beat in their homes. We live in a world where 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted. We live in a world where, in fact, in a country where that happens once every 2 minutes. Health care for women is out of balance with health care for men. Salaries for women are out of balance with salaries for men. In the church, good heavens. Of the 20 biggest Presbyterian churches, how many women do you suppose are head of staff? 1. We're trying to do the right thing here, but it's a struggle, as we call Jan. We're paying attention. We're going to take a good step forward, I trust the congregation will, on September 4th, but we're not there. Now, this is the world in which we live in. Pop culture is such that our girls are sending naked pictures of themselves over their cell phones. And we have a masculine deity. So what do? Do we toss the Bible out? Some people would. But for me, what I see in the midst of the Scriptures, because it's worked this way for centuries in them, it's like the seeds of the destruction of abusive power are sown into the fabric of the Scriptures themselves. It's almost like the authors of the Scriptures didn't know. Thorough going through the Scriptures is an attitude towards the feminine that is not coherent with the basic message of the Scriptures, which is the message of Exodus and freedom and fullness, which is the message of a God that moves from death to new life. This undermines that sort of meta thing that goes on and is filled all the way through Scriptures. It happened with slavery. The Scriptures from Genesis to Revelation pretty much assume slavery is slavery. People preach sermons like the one I'm preaching right now, back in the 19th century, explaining that no, Scripture, though it assumes slavery is all right, nevertheless, the messages of Scripture undermine the notion that slavery is an appropriate action given the God of love. Those same Scriptures are undermining that gender-weighted message that we've just imbibed and assumed, lo, these many, many years. The New Testament does make some moves. The New Testament is working to make that shift. I mean, it was late in the development of the Old Testament, and in the New Testament that there's a recognition that this masculine power has gotten out of line. In fact, the deepest redefinition of masculine power that takes place in the Scriptures is that the power of God is understood through the cross and resurrection, and not through the coercive power of one who wins wars. Instead, it's through a willingness to sacrifice and to let go, a willingness to allow new life to emerge in the midst even of destruction. And there's the final vision. The final vision of the New Testament longs for that union of masculine and feminine, longs for that union that will reflect the presence and the strength and the power of God. Not male and female, but masculine and feminine. Because it does reflect that generative, creative, receptive sense of who God is. In view of that, do we say our Father at the beginning of the Lord's Prayer? Do we even call it the Lord's Prayer? Do we change the words of the lyrics? Do we at 10 o'clock sing, "This is my Father's house," with great gusto? Well, maybe not. But I understand it's familiar. The language is familiar, and so it really kind of roils with us and turns us upside down. I mean, because the image of the Father has been a great comfort to many people. Father of great power, in whose loving arms we can rest. And I understand that, and it's why I've tried not to just jolt everything and make changes immediately or something. And I'm not trying to say that the way we've grown up was bad or wrong. I think what I'm trying to say is now is a moment where the gospel has opened up this issue to the church, where the good news of the nature of God has begun to ask the church, should we not pay attention to this thing? Now, what we're looking for, I recognize, is balance. We're not looking to go back to an entirely feminine view of God, but in 2011, balance is not 50-50. It does not achieve what we look for. And so that's why we push the envelope. That's why I seek to make the change in this place. The billboards in this country sell the female body everywhere, just like Sarah was sold to Pharaoh. Little girls are sexting. And we have a message of beauty, of what the feminine can be as it expresses itself in union with the masculine. Isn't that what we want to do?